our children was given a new Bible, and she asked me to read from it today, and I am very pleased to do that. However, I'll need to borrow somebody's reading glasses. Somebody have a pair of reading glasses that... Here you go. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Great. All right, and we've been reading from the Sermon on the Mount, which you know is Matthew 5 to 7. But this is now the last Sunday of Epiphany. Next Sunday, Lent starts. And so we switch over now to the story of Jesus' transfiguration. And so from Matthew 17 we read, and this will be a little different than your bulletin because it's a little different version, but it'll be close. Now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him. And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their faces and were greatly afraid. But Jesus came and touched them and said, Arise and do not be afraid. When they had lifted their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. Now as they came down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, saying, Tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man is risen from the dead. Let us pray. Lord, may your words only be spoken and your words only heard. We do ask this all for your love's precious sake. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. Thank you very much. Well, today we are finishing up our sermon series, Hooked. For those of you who have been here for the entire series, good for you. You can now say, I have spit the hook. And I sort of wanted to have little flies I tied with little things tied, and you could take them away from today and put them somewhere saying, I spit the hook. In this series, the first week, we looked at what a hook is. And we said a hook is an ordinary, everyday situation, the kind of thing we experience every day of our lives. But it evokes an emotional reaction, an automatic, emotionally charged action. And that action puts us on autopilot, and it has a predictable, undesirable result. And so we said that we learn these hooks when we're young, typically between the ages of 4 to 8, and so they look to us like reality. And because of reality, we think we always have to be like a fish flopping in a boat with a hook hanging out of our mouth, but we don't. If we can become mindful of what hooks are, then we can learn that they're not reality, they're just biases, prejudices, predispositions, and if we can recognize them for what they are, we can spit the hook and be free of them. That was week 1. In week 2, we looked at a specific hook and the way that hooks work so that we could understand a little bit more about how we come to be unhooked, how we can spit the hook. And so in that week, we looked at how our culture encourages us to over-identify with our roles and to think of ourselves narrowly and specifically and rigidly in terms of one thing. I am this, I am that. When none of us are narrowly or singly that simple thing. And when we think of ourselves, when we over-identify with a role like that, when we think of ourselves narrowly and singly and rigidly, then we're unable to adapt. We're unable to adapt to a changing world, to changing situations. And it makes us just like a bull in a china shop. Unwilling to adapt, unable to change, unable to be flexible to the way, in an increasingly flexible world, we just cling all the more to what we think, to the role that we think we need to occupy, and we're like a bull charging through a china shop, and there's a lot of people in the world like that right now. And we said instead what we need to do is we need to actually let go of those roles. And we need to come into the transforming presence of God and allow God to transform us, that then we can go back and inhabit those roles with more grace, with more compassion, with more love, more kindness than we did before. And that's really the only hope we have in this world. And then last week we said that when we spit the hook, we're moving away from something. What is it that we're moving towards? We don't just want to move away from something, we want to move to something. Otherwise we spit the hook and we end right back up in the boat. And we said that what we're moving towards is who we want to be. We want to know why we exist in this world, what our purpose is, and then we want to walk our why. And that's what we talked about last week, how important it is that we walk our why. Otherwise, we're always going to be reacting to people and circumstances, to perceived slights, to things that people, or real slights, or things that people did or didn't do. We said that the tendency, the hook, is hurt people. But if we know who we are and walk our why, even when we hurt, we don't have to hurt in return. We can choose to be a different kind of person who stops those cycles of hurt instead. And so this week we want to wrap it all up by thinking about precisely how we do this. What is the most efficient way to change? What is the most efficient way to be transformed? What is the most efficient way to turn, as the initial song referenced, to be someone who's turning, who's being transformed? In the midst of a difficult situation, uses that situation as a catalyst for growth. And the answer is surprising, because it's not to do some big grandiose thing. In fact, doing big grandiose things often get in the way. But it's actually to do what we can with what we have where we are. So it's just to make tiny little changes, to take tiny little steps. And it's to do what we can with what we have right exactly where we are. Many years ago, I was serving with a youth ministry team, and on this youth ministry team was a young woman who I came to know was struggling with addiction. She had an alcohol problem. And we went to a speaker one night, and this speaker said that they had a word from God and felt like there was somebody out in the congregation who was struggling with alcohol, and if they came up and had said a prayer, that they'd be delivered from this situation. And so the young woman was really excited. She went up, the person said a prayer, and she came back, and she said with incredible enthusiasm, "I've been healed. I'll never drink again my whole life long." And of course, in that situation, I wanted to rejoice with her and support her and so on and so forth, but something in the back of my mind was saying, this is bad news. This is bad news, because though God sometimes works that way, most of the time, God does not. And for those who suffer from addictions, for those in the AA program, for instance, we know that the death knell for a person, literally often, the death knell for a person who struggles with alcohol is to say, "I'll never drink again." Because that's too big a statement. That's too grandiose a statement. A person can't accomplish that. All we can say is, "I won't drink today." It's that tiny little thing. It's that tiny. I can go through one day, but I'll never drink again. Forget it. Forget it. I can't do that. And so it's this small step approach. That's the secret. And as it turned out, this young woman did go back to drinking in very short order after that. And it wasn't until she learned to work the program, one day at a time, to move away from those grandiose statements, "I'll never do this again," to just take it one day, one small step at a time, that she found the freedom that God wanted for her to know. So that's actually what's taught in this morning's gospel, and is an incredibly profound way. Think about this for a moment. The three of the disciples follow Jesus up on this mountain. Jesus is transfigured, so they see Jesus just radiate glory. I mean, divine energy is just crackling on this mountaintop. It's the most incredible thing they have ever seen. And it's not just Jesus just pouring off energy, but all of a sudden Moses and Elijah are there also. So these people who are dead are now present again, and they're there to talk with Jesus and encourage Jesus. And there's this just pregnant moment, this moment that's just as ripe can be, where God can speak to these disciples and ask them virtually anything. I mean, you're looking at this, seeing what's possible, and you're thinking, wow, if God can do this, what's God going to ask him to do? I can do this. Look what I've done to Jesus. Look what these people I've brought along this side. Man, what's God going to ask him to do in light of what they've experienced there, what they've seen there? Does God say, go down and overthrow Rome? This power you see at work up here today, man, that power will work through, and you go down and you can overthrow Rome. Does he say, this power you see at work down here, man, you can do anything. I want you to go down from here, and I want you to end slavery. This power that you see at work here, this power that I want you to go down, and I want you to champion women's rights. God doesn't say any of those things. God doesn't make any big, grandiose statement like that. All he does, he makes a tiny little statement, and he says, listen to Jesus. That's the only thing God asks us. One, do what you can with what you have where you are. You can listen to Jesus. No matter where you are, no matter what you have, you can listen to Jesus. And in listening to Jesus, the seeds are sown. The tiny little steps are sown that are going to make those great, big changes. We'll come back to that in a minute, all right? So this idea that the most successful way, the most efficient way to change our life is not in grandiose statements, is not in grandiose goals, is not in these big ideals, but in these tiny little changes, these tiny little steps. How do you follow Jesus? You follow Jesus the way you do anything else, one step at a time. Now, what do those tiny changes look like? Well, there's 3 areas in our life we can make big changes, but since I'm turning over a new leaf, I'm trying to spit the hook, I'm only preaching 1 sermon on a Sunday morning, all right? So I'm not preaching 3 anymore, so we're not going to talk about all 3 of those steps. I'll mention them. The first one is we can change our motivations. And so if we can go from finding our have to and feeling like we have to in a situation to finding our want to, then that'll change the whole situation, and it will empower us to make the change that we want to make. So if I get up in the morning and say, I have to go to church again, then I might not even go to church. Because, you got up this morning, it's cold, and you want to stay in bed. I have to go to church again. Oh, poor me. But if I can say, man, I want to go to church. Because I know that when I go to church, my week is better. I know the church helps me become a better person. I want to have a relationship with God. I want to do the right thing. There's people that I want to see there. There's people that want to see me. And so it's important that I want to go to church. See, if I can change it from I have to I want to, then we're likely to actually engage in that behavior and benefit from the benefits that behavior offers us. So that's the first small change we can change. It's just simply a change in our motivation, looking for the want-tos in things rather than the have-tos in things. I have to go to work. I hate my job. Well, okay, but where's the want-to in that? Well, I want to provide for my family. I want to be able to afford Xbox Live every month. I want to be able to do this or that, whatever it is. Okay, there's the want to in that. And this gives me the ability to do that. So there's my want to. If I can change that, then I'm going to go into work with a whole different attitude, a whole different approach, and it will make a big difference in that particular situation. Second change is in habits. And so if we can change our habits, then we take all the power that goes into doing the right thing, and it just becomes routine. Now we don't have to talk ourselves into it, psych ourselves up. It's just, we don't have to do anything. It just happens naturally. So anything that's important, we ought to make a habit out of that thing. It's going to take a little bit of work at the start, but once the habit is established, now we just coast into it. Again, that's like going to church. I never had to argue. I had to argue with my kids for a very brief time about going to church, but once they understood that it is just what we do on Sunday morning, it's just what we do, they never argued again because there was no point to arguing. They found the other things where you did argue because this is a habit. And once it's a habit, because I believe there's benefit to it, I believe it sets my kids up well for life, and so I want it to be a habit in their life, and so we just made it a habit from the start, and that's how habits work. Important things, institutionalized in habits. That's another way we make changes. But the way we want to talk about today is simply in terms of mindset. And I can't remember the name of the woman. Even, do you remember the name of the woman?
Carol Dweck.
Carol Dweck, okay. I couldn't remember, but we had a psychologist last night here who did remember. She wrote a book years and years ago, Carol Dweck, where she popularized the idea of a mindset. And she just said there's two kinds of mindsets of people. They have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. And in a fixed mindset, we think of ourselves as a set entity. I am this or I am that. I'm fat, I'm not creative, I'm this, I'm stupid, I'm smart. But when we think of ourselves, we think this is all we have. And when we're in a growth mindset, we think that we're always capable of a little bit more. There's always additional possibilities. There's always additional choices. And so growth mindsets, rather than just saying, this is my fate, this is my destiny, I'm not creative, I'll never be creative. I'm fat, I'll always be fat. My whole family is fat, I'm just always going to be fat. Or the opposite, I'm skinny, my whole family is going to be skinny when we want to put some weight on. And so that person just resigns themselves to their fate. Whereas a person who says, has a growth mindset, says, you know what, I might not have been too creative in the past, but that doesn't mean I can't be creative tomorrow. And they find a way to be creative. The person who says, you know what, I might have been overweight in the past, and my family has history being, but that doesn't mean I have to be overweight my whole life. A growth mindset's I can change, I can learn, I can become something I've not yet been. And as it turns out, and this is amazing, and I love this is one of the best parts of being a priest in this day and age. There's some really hard parts, but this is a great part, is that science is always discovering these things that faith always knew. So science, through empirical research, back in the day of Jesus, for instance, they didn't have brain imaging, they didn't have magnetic resonance imaging, any of those sorts of things. And so they just didn't know literally what was going on inside of people's heads, but they knew what was going on inside of people's heads. And so what we have come to know is that the brain cares immensely about what we believe. So it turns out Jesus knew what he's talking about when he talked about how important it is what people believe. And so before we do anything, what we know from actually being able to look at the brain in ways we couldn't do that before, is before you do anything, just milliseconds before you do any action whatsoever, your brain fires a whole series of little electrical waves, little electrical pulses that prime your muscles to actually engage in a behavior. If it doesn't fire, if you don't have these potential indicators, if it doesn't fire, then nothing happens. So if a person says, I'm not creative, and come into a situation where you need to be creative, the brain never fires those little electrical waves that prime a person to be creative, and they'll never be creative. But a person who comes into a situation and says, I need to be creative in this situation, so I'm going to learn to be creative, the brain says, it believes what's being said, and so it fires these little electrical waves, and then the person is able to be creative. If you don't believe it, it ain't going to happen. If you do believe it, it primes it for it to be the case. So that's the growth mindset. Now, this isn't just positive thinking, that's just silly. But it is to say that growth and change is an important part of realizing our God-given potential. And here's what I want to say about that just so clearly is faith is the ultimate mindset. You see, faith is the ultimate growth mindset. Because if you believe in God, many of us believe in a personal God. I believe in a personal God made known in Jesus Christ, a God who is for us, a God who is personally invested in my life and in your life. Others of us aren't sure what's out there or believe in some kind of big something or other who oversees all that is. Whatever kind of God you believe in, it's a hugely different thing if I'm in this life all on my own, or if I'm in this life where there is something bigger than myself who makes things bigger than me possible. And if that is a personal God who loves me and is deeply invested in me and will work with me, then that's a whole new game. Because what that says is no matter what I'm facing, some of you are facing some big stuff right now. Whatever the challenges might be, some of you have some huge challenges right now. Whatever the heartbreak might be, some of you, man, you're just struggling with some real heartbreak, is that with God's help, one tiny step at a time, you can face it. You can beat it. You can get through it. You can become the person you want to be that God's calling you to be. I can get through it. I can become the person that God's calling me to be. So God didn't say to the top of the mountain to the disciples, he didn't thunder down and say, go overthrow Rome. He said, just listen to Jesus. And the disciples went down and they listened to Jesus and they encouraged other people to listen to Jesus. And now, 2,000 years after that, Rome is just something you study in the history books. And this nation that was built on might and cruelty and violence and military force, it no longer exists. But Christianity, it's still changing the world. People are still listening to Jesus. That power is still at work in the world. If they'd gone down off the mountain and they'd rushed Caesar, they would have been killed on the spot and the Jesus movement would have died right then and there. But when they went down and did the little thing they could, they did what they could with what they had, when they could, right where they were. They listened to Jesus. It set the principle in motion that would change things. God didn't say from the top of the mountain, end slavery. He said, listen to Jesus. Because if they'd gone off the mountain, they'd started saying, all of you need to let your slaves go, they would have been butchered on the spot and the Jesus movement would have died. But he set into motion the seeds that if they listened to Jesus, they would end slavery. And so within the New Testament itself, there's a book called Onesimus. And in this book, we learn of a person who has a slave, and he's starting to listen to Jesus because he's listening to Jesus. Paul had taught him to listen to Jesus. And so he says to Paul, I've got this slave, and I've been thinking about this, and I'm thinking I should let this slave go. What do you think I should do? And Paul says, well, you just do what you keep doing. You listen to Jesus, and Jesus will tell you what you need to do. And he lets the slave go, and we know this because in church history, we read that just a couple years after that, a man becomes a bishop by the name of Onesimus, who history tells us was actually the slave that this man had, who he let go. And because the church, in listening to Jesus, realized that there is no slave nor free, but that we're all the same, recognized the values and rights and privileges that this man had, and they elevated him to the place of a bishop. And the seeds that were set in place as people over the ages listened to Jesus would become the abolitionist movement that would actually lead to the end of slavery. And when it came to women's rights, if people had said, if God had thundered down from the mountain, you need to go and tomorrow you need to emancipate all the women of Israel and Rome, and they would have gone down off there, they would have been thrown off a cliff or stoned on the spot. But when they, I'm not going that long yet, am I? I hope not. I've been trying to be really good. When they listened to Jesus, then when they listened to Jesus, then they went down and they saw the way that Jesus respected women. And they thought, you know what? In Christ, there's neither slave, there's neither male nor female. We're all equal under God. Women have rights just like men have. They have gifts. They have abilities. In many ways, they're more capable than we are. And so in the book of Acts, there's a woman called Dorcas. And Dorcas is actually a clergy person. So within the first century, they're already raising women as they're following the example of Jesus, listening to the highest levels of leadership in the church. This woman has her own church. She has a house church. And so now sometimes the church is more hooked than any other institution. And so we just preserve antiquated prejudices and biases. And so some churches are not faithful in listening to Jesus. And so some churches do not respect women. But I want you to know, this church does. And when the church listens to Jesus, when the church behaves like Jesus, the seeds are set into place where one small step at a time, one small change at a time, the women's right movement, that's where the women's rights movement gets its start. And it's where it gains its power and initiative and gives us the world that we have today. So, how do we make these changes? We listen to Jesus one small step at a time. We do what we can, with what we have, where we are. And though it might not be a big thing initially, enough people doing it over time. Just doing what Jesus asked us to do. Be kind, love your neighbor, treat everybody the same, fight for justice, fight for freedom. That over time is what changed the world and continues to change the world, like frankly, nothing else ever has, or that I can see ever will. And so we want to end this series on a high note. And tonight I'm really thankful that the band is actually in here for this, so that's really good. And we want to end this series on a high note, because what we want to say, in no uncertain terms, is with God's help, with God's power, by God's grace, yes, we can do what we need to do, the people that God calls us to be, to make the world that we all want to live in. And sometimes the world in which we live is discouraging. I think it's always been that way. So sometimes more than others, for sure. Sometimes our personal worlds are discouraging. Sometimes we are tempted to get down. Sometimes we're tempted to think, this is my fate. It's never going to be any different than this. But that's not true. By God's grace, with God's help, we can spit the hook. We can live free. We can be transformed. And as we're transformed, continue to transform the world. Yes, we can. And you can stand, clap, sing, sit, dance, whatever you want to do.